to the 21st presentation in this year-long series. And like all presentations for the last 30-some years, I've divided this year into quarters. When I began devising courses at San Francisco State in 1966, my first course, we were on the semester system, but the quarter system was coming into play. So I did a end run around. I had a quarter system, but 2 quarters that meshed together so that you could have more than 10 weeks, but not quite the full 13 weeks. So I'm used to that kind of a structure. Even though it's a quarter, the quarters overlap in such a way that you could really put it together as a trimester year, which is an ancient technique, by the way. We're looking at the tidal wave that is hitting our civilization as we speak, and as we have been speaking, myself for almost 50 years on the university level. But the presages for us go back quite a ways. They go back, in fact, to the middle of the 17th century, back to about the 1650s, where for that time, a kind of a trigger was pulled on the way in which language is used by civilization. It took a while for those who were born in the 1640s, maturing in the 1650s, and coming to their adulthood in the 1660s and onward, to be able to have the education, the background, the experience to begin their work. And it took about 10 to 15 years for that to come out. And in fact, in the 1680s, one found all of a sudden an enormous jump in the comprehension of the use of language. And it came in the form of mathematics. In 1687, when Isaac Newton published his Principia Mathematica in Latin, it was understood by just a handful of people at the time who had the patience, the intellect, and the insight to be able to wade through it. And it took a while, and it took Newton a while to reread and constantly rewrite and bring out. And by the time of the 3rd edition of Principia Mathematica, he was already into the 1700s, almost into the 1720s, and had given up mathematics as his sole concern and profession. He held the Lucasian chair of mathematics at Cambridge University. But by that time, in his older age, born in 1642, he was the master of the mint of England. That is to say, he controlled the design of the structure of the economy of the British Empire, which was based on the money, the pound. And it was Newton's great genius that he was able to set up what eventually became known later on, because of the structure of it, that it was a political economy. And the surge of the power of the British Empire is due to the incredible intelligence of Newton. And the Principia Mathematica in the 3rd edition began to be clear enough in its improved and revised language to get across that he was working with calculus as a new scalar in the way in which mankind could express the infinitesimal and the infinite. That there is a way to have an integral moving from zero to oneness with an infinite number of steps involved. That one could have a mathematical analytic of any degree of specificity and exactness, and one could track it and be able to not only track what it was that you were after, but the entire movement of how the mathematics got to where it got and what was the scalar with which it was working. And the same thing could be done in reverse of going from 1 to 0, this kind of a differential calculus, and one could get back to the zero quality of nature with its pristineness, without any kind of occurrence in between. And this was a monumental development. At the very same time, G.W. Leibniz in Germany was developing the calculus as well on a parallel course. And very often in civilization, there are parallels. There are tunable persons, not just individuals, but persons. And sometimes 3, sometimes more. Sometimes they're pairs of pairs. But that tunability is consistent. And Leibniz's language was superior to Newton's language. What Newton characterized as fluxions became in Leibniz's calculus the differential and the integral calculus that we use his terminology today, though we use Newton's whole understanding of calculus, of mathematics, as a springboard that eventually, when there was a generation of persons who could understand Newton really completely, there was a revolution in mathematics. And as we've talked about, the first great translation of Newton into a modern language, out of the Latin, into a modern language was into French. And it was Madame du Châtelet, the longtime friend of Voltaire, lover of Voltaire. And while she was working on translating Newton's Principia into French, Voltaire was using his genius to help her to understand the incredible creative genius of the way in which calculus, with its differential and its integral pairing, was extraordinary. And his cue was Leibniz, not Newton. And in fact, Voltaire wrote a classic short novel. It's still in print. It's been in print since it was published. It's called Candide. Candide is a protagonist who is very innocent in a world of dangers and ignorance and miscalculations and so forth. And he survives going through this kind of a world in search of the best of all possible worlds. And Candide is based on Leibniz, because Leibniz's calculus came from understanding not the Western mathematical precedents. Newton learned from Isaac Barrow, who was the Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge before him. The whole history of development of mathematics, and really was genius and understood. But Leibniz learned from the most strange source of all, from a Jesuit Latin translation of the Chinese I Ching. And he learned that the yin-yang of the Tao Te works both ways. It can be infinitesimally exact. It can be infinitely expansive in its exactness as well. And so with Voltaire and Madame de Châtelet, you had for the first time a generation of French mathematicians who read like a who's who of the way in which new kinds of mathematics were being done. Fourier, Lagrange, etc., etc. You could name several dozen who sprung mathematics from its classical Greek origins into what that reference wave of 1650 triggered, that mathematics now was a new kind of expressiveness in language. And if one could learn to read and write equations, you could go almost anywhere, and we have. The difficulty is that to read equations out loud is not intelligible. You have to have a blackboard to write them so that someone can read them. This is one of the pitfalls of the way in which the limitations of calculus, of mathematics, has constantly been broached for someone to try to express it differently. And in French, in the French language, 100 years after Voltaire and Madame de Châtelet, in that next generation that began after Fourier and Lagrange and all of the French mathematicians and genius, you had a revolution in poetry in France. And the first great poet of the new French language was Baudelaire. And Baudelaire instantly had those who began to understand. A young semi-waif named Rimbaud at 19 was writing a great book, Flowers of Evil, in poetry of the new French. And his older friend, Paul Verlaine, absolutely entranced with what the young man was able to discourse with him. And so with Baudelaire and Rimbaud and Verlaine, and then the great genius of Mallarmé, whose poetic was so startling because it was very close to Monet's Impressionism. And one had Monet, one had Renoir, one had all of the Impressionists, one had the French symbolists, and all of a sudden you had a whole revolution in the way in which art caught up with mathematics, and it was recognized that mathematics was really an art, not a science yet, but an art, moving towards a science. If one could have an intermediate step, an intermediate stage that was comprehensive, that not only made sense, but had a new calibration of what sense is. And that intermediate step between art and science is history. Not history as a subject. The best way to phrase it is to take a word from calculus. It is a phase. It is a phase in a scalar, in a spectrum of a development where a phase of matter would be that it is a gas. Another phase of matter is that it is a solid. When you have an intermediate phase between a gas and a solid, that there is a liquid, now you've got something that you can compose with. But if you add a fourth, which was added in the 20th century, about 2 decades into it, the term began, of course, with an insight of a Frenchman, we've talked about de Broglie, and he understood that there is such a thing as a pilot wave that does not decay, that does not expand, but maintains its continuity. Its energy quotient carries continuously. And along with de Broglie, one had the French poetic philosopher Henri Bergson say, the key then is time, but that time is not a clock, it's not a calendar, it's not a calibration, it's a duration. It in fact is a creative duration. And one of the first of Henri Bergson's great world-shattering books, the English translation is Creative Evolution. One has to have the transform mind. You have to have, as Wallace Stevens once in one of his poems, he said, you have to have a mind of summer to be able to understand poetry. You have to become unthawed from the way that you were all the time, not knowing that it was all the time, to slip out of that time, to slip out of that kind of time into a continuity that is creative and memorable, braided together. And history does that as a phase between art and science as phases, and where they occur in that, not so much a sequence, but in that spectrum, they occur in a field of vision. And it's that ecology of a field of vision from which art emerges, begging to be heard invisibly by science so that the science and the art would tune together. They needed to have, in that differential conscious field, a kaleidoscopic conscious scalar that made the phases all together as an ecology. And once the artists and the scientists were historically begun to be understood together, not together as an integral, but initially as a differentiation, as a differential, with the field of vision, now called, the first person to call it this was William James, who was a very close friend of Henri Bergson. He called it a stream of consciousness. There is a stream of consciousness that is the flow. In fact, it's not a flow like a liquid, but it is a flow like a very complex, more primordial liquid. And out of that, in the early 20th century, came a fourth phase of matter, the plasma. The plasma is like a stream of consciousness. But as soon as one becomes sophisticated enough to understand that this field of vision is a field, it's a field of differential consciousness, not a stream. History is the stream, but it's not just a stream. It's a great complex river system that has an enormous delta that develops out of this. And it has an enormous range of sources in the highlands, in the snowpack or the rainfall, and all those rivulets, all those streams coming down to this great river that flows through this massive, differential, historical, kaleidoscopic, conscious history delta into the ocean of the cosmos. All of this happened almost in a peculiar, surreal fashion in the 20th century. Happened so covertly, so esoterically, so geniusly, so artistically, so scientifically, so historically but not really understood, that we have come into the 21st century beleaguered by a gift of possibility and no way to utilize any of it. Because that reference wave, like a trigger starting this cascade of the mathematization of language, finally, like the French system of the decimal to the nth degree is digital. And as soon as you move to that nth degree of digital, and you can put it into a technology, which is the historical link in vision that leads to science. Now, by 2014, by May, late May of 2014, you have what used to be called a phantasmagoria. Everyone is chaotically dazzled by what they see, hear, taste, feel, etc., dream, etc., and don't understand at all, because they have no way to understand at all. One of the figures who dealt with this in the 20th century was Carl Jung. And the most difficult of Carl Jung's books to read is Answer to Job. Antwoord Job. When it was first published in the works of Carl Jung, published by the Bollingen series, the Bollingen Foundation, it was in a book that they were doing called Psychology and Religion, West and East. I remember buying a copy of it at the University of Wisconsin in the university's bookstore in the basement of the student union. And in those days, paperbacks were all by publisher, all the Penguin books together, the Anchor books, the Harper Torch books, and so forth. And with the Meridian books, along with Philosophies of India by Heinrich Zimmer, one had Psychology, East and West. And it was so popular because it was really difficult that a single paperback edition finally was published of Answer to Job. Now, of course, one can find the single copy published by Princeton, which took over the Bollingen series some long while ago. And it's still in print. Everything's in print. And Jung says, it was very difficult for me to even come to writing Answer to Job, because even though I have been a psychologist, a psychiatrist on the world-class level for as long as many people have been alive, I could not understand why it bothered me so much that I could not understand the book of Job. And the fever broke out when he was trying to write a book that was so complex. The first volume of the three was called Aeon, A-I-O-N. And when Aeon was published in its original German, the 3-volume edition, it was the frontispiece of a photograph of a Gnostic figure wrapped with a serpent and a lion-like face. And right away, people wrote this off as being weird and strange. What in the world is an aeon anyway? Well, it's a time period of enormous length in terms of ordinary time, but of even more enormous meaning in terms of eternal timelessness. The second part of that 3-volume set was archetypes of the collective unconscious. One of Jung's famous phrases was to somebody asking him, how can I understand archetypes? And his reply was, you don't have archetypes, they have you. And the 3rd volume in the German edition had this quality that was elusive, and so he put it with other works, like Mysterium Coniunctionis, the alchemical coming together of the two, not into one, but the two becoming a third, which then makes a hermetic thrice greatestness. That third can be a child, but it can also, with perfect tuning, be a presence, which is eternal. When the Bollingen series was putting out the collected works of Jung, they could not put that 3rd volume that was related to Mysterium Coniunctionis, that was related to Ion and archetypes of the collective unconscious. They refused, because of all kinds of criticism and carping and anger, frustration, and so forth, to put it into the collected works of Jung in the same black volumes with the gold and copper design on it. So they published it separately in a red cover with no design, not part of the collected works. And, well, it's edited by Marie-Louise von Franz from a manuscript that Carl Jung wrote who knows when and under what conditions. And she's the one who's presenting this, and it's called Aurora Consurgens, which is Jung's psychological, not commentary, but opening, continuing to open until it was opened into the field of differential consciousness itself. And it was based on a fulcrum, a pivot, a trigger of a secret last short book manuscript by the dying Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas, who is the patron intellectual structure of the Roman Catholic Church. It was on alchemy. And it was written not for everyone. It was written only for one person. It was written for Thomas Aquinas' teacher. In English, his name is Albert the Great. Albertus Magnus in Latin. And it's Albertus Magnus who understood enormously that Aquinas had this incredible exactness of not mentality, but incisive mind, that he could go into the details with as much filigree as was necessary. It's often said in the world of very large scholarship that Thomas Aquinas had the kind of mind that in India you would find with Shankaracharya, who was the developer of Vedanta. Out of the Vedas and out of all of the Indian yoga, he made Vedanta, and his commentaries on Indian things India are infinitesimally detailed. The great Indian physicist who was much like Shankaracharya, like Thomas Aquinas, was Chandrasekhar, who is one of the greatest mathematical minds of all time, who was the one who figured out the math of event horizons, of what became black holes, et cetera, back in the 30s. When Jung came to write the book of Job, he was stewing in aeon, the archetypes of the collective unconscious, the mysterium conjunctionis, the aurora consurgens. How does this whole alchemy, how does this incredible detail, how does it play out in not just the psychology, not just in the psychiatry, not in just the psyche, but the field within which the psyche has transformation. The psyche is psyche in the world, in the natural cycle, but the natural cycle, which can go around and around like a circle, can also be subject to a magnetic skew, and not just a magnetic skew, but a magnetic pair of skews, introducing a chirality into the rotation so that the circle becomes a spiral in time. And in fact, it becomes a double spiral in time, because it can spiral very, very, very small. It can spiral very, very, very expansive. So it's a double helix. Beginning to understand? Beginning to get it? All of this happened in the middle of the 20th century. And the cue was that Jung learned again and again that if you stayed in the West, in the Western tradition, you would never be able to emerge from it enough, long enough, deep enough, high enough, small enough, large enough to be able to begin to understand. So that by working with a psyche east and west, now you had a pair that would not only have the symmetry of an integral, but it would have the double chiral of a differential. So that one, now by the 1960s, when there began to be a population of my peers understanding, we can understand the East faster than the Easterners can. They can understand the West faster than we can. But we get the East faster than, because they no longer had the natural, almost naive openness to not just receive it, but to participate with it. They not only received the Western tradition, they participated with it. And more of the great scientists and engineers and mathematicians are Asians. India, China, Korea, Japan, etc., etc. And more of the savants and sages of the Eastern tradition are Westerners. who really do understand, who really do participate. We're going to take a little break, but this is just an introduction to WET, that this year is the Parayana, which is a double transform of what was the great accomplishment in the East that got transformed about 2,000 years ago by a new aeon then, and is now being distilled into its double second transform, and that this double second transform is the distillation of kaleidoscopic history becoming understandable, where the arts and sciences are able to participate together in what long ago was called the ideal of a Renaissance. Universities that are universal because they teach cosmically by participation. Let's take a break. And let's begin with this observation. Genius though he was, Jung was dead wrong. The errors are not his errors. The flaws are not his flaws. They belong to his time. The person working on trying to understand scientifically through a scientific history. First person to essay this and to try to do this was Henry Adams. Henry Adams' great-grandfather was John Adams, the second president of the United States. His grandfather was John Quincy Adams, the sixth president of the United States. And his father was Francis Adams, who was the England during the Civil War under Lincoln. And Henry Adams grew up in one of the most distinguished households in the United States. And he was bothered by the fact that everyone always was talking about Jefferson and the crisis of the War of 1812 under his chosen successor, James Madison. And then it carried on to James Monroe, so that in effect Jefferson had 6 presidencies, 6 elections, quarter of a century, and by the time his grandfather came into office, the scientific qualities of John Quincy Adams were not recognizable, and he only survived one term, and was defeated the next term by a man who rode his horse into the White House in victory, Andrew Jackson, a Kentucky ruffian general who changed the nature of the American experience from a Jeffersonian republic to a free-for-all. From the Lewis and Clark expedition of the Louisiana Territory to go west, young man, and take as much as you can, fast as you can. It's all open, land for free. Never mind that there are Indians and tribes If they get in the way, we'll move them. And he did. Henry Adams wrote a 9-volume history of the United States under the presidencies of Jefferson and Madison. And as he did so, he became more and more upset by the fact that what's happening here is a larger scale. It isn't just America. It isn't just the United States, vis-a-vis the old world. It isn't that the new world is different from the old world. It's just a different venue. But something else is happening. And it came to him because he was used to traveling in Europe, used to languages and so forth. He was on the coast of France traveling. Henry's wife was Clover, whom he loved. And Clover was an excellent horsewoman, etc., friend, wife. After Clover died tragically, Henry Adams became a recluse, lived in Washington, D.C., and hardly went anywhere. But with Clover on the French coast, they were visiting at low tide Mont Saint-Michel, out on the sands off the coast, and with low tide one could walk out. And something about Saint-Michel being periodically an island, not a part of Europe, but apart from it, like an island. And he carried that impress, and when he and Clover went further on their trip and went into France, south of Paris, they were coming to Chartres Cathedral, and across this huge field with yellow blossoms, it was that time of the year, there was the island of Chartres Cathedral rising out of the land, rising out of history. And it hit Henry Adams like a sledgehammer that there are forms to history. There are histories of history that follow cycles. And he was enough of a savant in many things that he took the physics of elements, as it was known in the early 20th century, and he applied the phases as a rule of phase of the way in which all processes happen: gas, liquid, solid, etc. And he wrote a beautiful little essay called The Rule of Phase Applied to History. But the big volume that came out from him that has been a classic, and it's been in print ever since, in all kinds of fancy editions. It's called Mont Saint-Michel in Chartres. And he says there is a form to the time cycle of civilization. And it has a pinnacle. It has an apex. It has an island like Chartres or like Saint-Michel that stands up and marks the time. And when the time is marked, that is what everyone has been calling for a long time, a millennium. And that millennium is independent of politics. It's independent of the power that people or groups of people or whole hordes of people think they have. Because when the time has come, the bell has struck, that's it. and that the millennium is the peak, and what happens that was a build-up for that whole millennium is now at the millennium, and it will run down from that peak until it reaches zero. And so the rule of phase applied to history, he was too ill to really have it published and offered, and he was old and a curmudgeon and so forth. Washington, D.C. It just disappointed him no end what had happened to everything. And he had a very intellectual, excellent brother, Brooks Adams. And after Henry's death, at the, oddly enough, the end of World War I, the Great War, he published a volume of the last essays of his brother, and it's called The Degradation of Democracy. And the rule of phase applied to history is the #1 pivot in that book. Brooks Adams was taken, by the way, in his own researches with utopian communities in America, the transcendentalists and so forth, and he was really quite an expert at that. So that Henry Adams, at the end of his life, had given a timeline for civilization. And he said the civilization in this timeline is under the constraints of universal physics and chemistry. And its timeline runs out in the 21st century. It runs out in 2118. Because it will no longer have any kind of psychic energy whatsoever from its pinnacle of Chartres at Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres. It will be completely bankrupt, devoid of energy. Forget the money, forget the power, forget everything else. There will be no juice. So we find ourselves in 2014. 2014 is only 4 years away from that, on the cusp of something which is endgame. One of Samuel Beckett's great works is entitled Endgame. Not Waiting for Godot, but Endgame is the one. Jung, in his flaw, it was not his flaw. It was a flaw that was seeping in all these centuries, like a bad habit become a bad characteristic, passed on by bad education, passed on by bad generations, becoming worse, so that there's no way that anyone is free to not be in that devolutionary swirl. You can have all the genius in the world, and the critique now is, look at all the Silicon Valley guys and girls. Look at all they have done. And they're turning out to be just like the robber barons of the 19th century. Just like those who commandeered the Industrial Revolution for their political economy, the railroads, et cetera, the banks. The Silicon Valley guys, those corporations, are the robber barons of the 21st century. They're doing the same thing. It's a critique that has been uttered now again and again. Here's where Jung tuned in to the flaw in Answer to Job, thinking that it was a brilliant insight on his part and not understanding that he was buying into an ancient flaw that was there a couple of thousand years before. That was there because it was cured a couple of thousand years before, but it was uncured because the understanding of the cure went back carelessly to an original flaw, and that original flaw seemed like we're cursed. It had two parts. Here's the first flaw. He's talking about Cain and Abel. One can therefore regard Abel as the imperfect prototype of God's son who is about to be begotten in Mary, just as Yahweh originally undertook to create a synonic equivalent of himself in the first man, Adam. Adam, so now he intends something similar, but much better. The extraordinary precaution measures above mentioned are designed to serve this person. The new son, Christ, shall be, on the one hand, a synonic man like Adam, mortal and capable of suffering, but on the other hand, he shall not be, like Adam, a mere copy, but God himself, begotten by himself as the Father and rejuvenating the Father as the Son. As God, he has always been God, and as the Son of Mary, who is plainly a copy of Sophia, he is the Logos, synonymous with nous, the mind. The Logos is the word, but it's the word in a saying that has a pithy unity to it, so it becomes a saying. The first classic collection of such sayings was, they collected sayings of Pythagoras. And the Greek term for those sayings, they all begin in the same way, ipsa dixit, he said. It's like the Confucius say Chinese desserts. He is the Logos synonymous with nous, who, like Sophia, is a master workman as stated by the Gospel according to St. John. This identity of mother and son is borne out over and over again in the myths. And so Jung goes to the myths. If you go to the myths, and you go mystically to the myths, you have a flow which the myths have. But if you go to the myths as an intellectual structure of a mythology, and you're studying the myths as symbolic types, then one does a conversion and the mind becomes attuned to the subtleties that are not tended to in myths because they're not subtle. They're natural, that have a ritual base that goes along with the way in which the natural seasons work, animals work, plants work. And yes, they can be integrated into symbols, and they do integrate into symbols quite naturally. But when the symbols become their own boss, their own taskmasters, and go back, they realize that this study of myths has given us an insight that if we change and control the ritual base, the myths will begin to conform to how the rituals are contained and constrained. So if we get obedience to our doctrines, we will have the right myths, and our integral understanding will win the day hands down. Everyone will understand this is the way it works. Not that it's natural, but this is the way it works. At least this is the way it works now for you and you and you and everybody, including us, and we control the way it works. We're human plus. Jung says, in these matters, the identity of a non-temporal, eternal event with a unique historical occurrence is something that is extremely difficult to conceive. He must, however, accustom himself to the idea that, quote, time is a relative concept and needs to be complemented by that of a, quote, simultaneous existence. In the bardo or pleroma of all historical processes, what exists in the pleroma as an eternal process appears in time as an aperiodic sequence. That is to say, it is repeated many times in an irregular pattern. For example, Yahweh had one good son and one who was a failure, Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau. And he goes on in that mode. And so one begins to have a typology, a theory of types. And just about the time that this theory of types, Jung's Psychology of Types, was his first great book. It came out in 1921 in German. It was about the time that Bertrand Russell was writing at the pinnacle of the philosophic filigree of having completed, with Alfred North Whitehead, Principia Mathematica in 3 volumes. Cambridge University Press, they're thick, dark blue with gold stamping. They look like the Torah itself. Their Principia Mathematica was more precise than Newton's Principia Mathematica, but so difficult to read, you cannot read it aloud. You cannot lift it off the page. So graduate students, undergraduates just hear about it apocryphally. Graduate students cannot read Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, just like no one could read Newton's for a long time, many generations. So they give you sections 1 through 56 of the first volume, and Cambridge published it in paperbound, so it was nice that graduates who pretend to have read it now can say, well, it says here in Principia Mathematica, and they go to some kind of a page, and, well, this is that. And the person who punctured holes, poked a finger in the eye of Bertrand Russell was Ludwig Wittgenstein. That this is not only not true, this is phantasmagoria. The only thing you can do with this is hone your criticality to include everything. One can understand to any kind of filigree whatsoever the nuts and bolts of everything. but it becomes increasingly self-destroying, useless, especially when one begins to understand that nuts and bolts are made out of atoms and that the atom can be split. It has subatomic particles and many subatomic particles, and they have a very strange way of being atomic, that they have a nucleus, the protons and the neutrons, and they are surrounded by the electrons in shells, in energy levels, but that the relationship of the electrons to the nucleus has a very strange kind of comportment. And one of the best little books ever done on that was done quite a while ago. Let's see, it was published in 1984, published by Academic Press. The author is Gad Fisher, Department of Chemistry, Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Beersheba, Israel. It's called Vibronic Coupling. Subtitle, The Interaction Between the Electronic and Nuclear Motions. Not the electrons and the neutrons and protons, but the nucleus and the electron cloud in its striations in their dynamis, in their dynamic. Whoa. Now you have something that is very akin to that fourth state, that fourth phase of matter, a plasma. Because when you add plasma to gas, liquid, and solid, with all four together, you have a combo, and now you have jazz. You no longer have a easy hierarchy, but you have an interplay of instruments that can improvise. Yeah, you can recognize this riff or that. It is jazz. And it is a spontaneous, not a composition, but a composingness that goes on while you're playing. This is different. It's not only radically different, it is twice over radically different. It is differential kaleidoscopically. And if you can't learn to learn, there's no way to get it at all. It isn't less than zero. It isn't a little bit more than zero. It is perfectly zero, and that, to misquote, as everyone does, Shakespeare, that's the rub. It is perfectly zero. The Sanskrit word for zero is ka, and there are many other words in Sanskrit that mean zero, but ka means perfectly zero. Not a 0 point. 0 points vanish into zeroness. A zero field is empty, but fertile. The fertility of a vacuum is just beginning to be understood in the 21st century, and that it goes back to the way in which subatomic particles all have something called a half-life. And many of the really subtle subatomic particles have such short half-lives. Well, what happens to them? They disappear. And then they appear, or disappear, or appear. They can go in and out creatively from a zero field empty vacuum comfortably. Doesn't bother them at all. Yes, they can decay into other particles. Those particles can decay. They all have the ability, the whole vibratorial universe has the ability to disappear into zero and to reappear into unlimited infinity. Let's come to something that is bordering on the profundity. It isn't just the West, but it's the East also that has this problem. And this problem is highlighted. This is a book by an Indian lady, dark-skinned Indian lady, who taught at the Deccan College in Pune, and among other places, and also at the University of Chicago, in Chicago. Her name is Malati Shenge. This volume is Language of the Harappans from Akkadian to Sanskrit. I have included a page from it in the illustration in your notes, just before the pages about beyond divisions. Since the birth of synthetic biology almost 15 years ago, the field has splintered into diverse tribes of scientists, all attempting to endow cells with new abilities. So there are tribes of human plus synthetic biology scientists, and their game is afoot, emphasis game. Time to settle the synthetic controversy. In this issue of Nature, the international publication for 120 some years of science, time to settle the synthetic controversy. If synthetic biology is to thrive, the world needs to decide now how the field should be regulated and supported, says Volker ter Meulen in the Worldview editorial in the same volume. This is getting towards Henry Adams' zero energy of civilization. It's getting towards the zero field, not a 0 point. Here's a whole conference on Secret Space Program and Breakaway Civilization Conference. And the whole quotation that heads the brochure for it, 0 point energy is the power source behind the Secret Space Program. June, San Mateo, California, near Silicon Valley. Right at the edge of the Okefenokee Swamp. I guess I never heard of Pogo or Walt Kelly, that there are really interesting characters that are at home in that Okefenokee and who seem very gentle, but they are profoundly unaffected by the phantasmagoria. Like Brer Rabbit, Pogo can always walk free. His friends, among them a little bug, and the little bug's usual phrase in a little cartoon bubble is just fine, J-E-S, just fine. And another one time was, we have met the enemy and he is us. She portrays in here that Sanskrit is not at all the language of the Aryans. In fact, there was no Aryan invasion that then came and took over and then brought their language Sanskrit into play. It took her almost, she's 80 now, she's still alive, still working. Took her almost a whole lifetime to be able to write such books and to show that the original civilization in India, in the whole, not just the Indus Valley, the river system, all the way down to the Arabian Sea, but all the way along the Baluchistan coast, all the way to the entrance through the Hindu Kush into Central Asia, everything from Oman to Samarkand, from Kabul in Afghanistan to the Ganges and beyond in central India, was a long-standing civilization of what usually is called racially the Dravidians, the black Indians. But that they had a working relationship in the 3rd millennium BC with the whole development that was happening in Sumer, especially after it's transformed into the Akkadian trading routes that went all the way from what is today, they don't call it Bombay anymore, Mumbai. All the way from Mumbai to Cyprus. That the Indian civilization and the Akkadian North Semitic civilization were in contact for hundreds of years, both at the apex of their civilizations. That the Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro was so sophisticated, they did not need to have standing armies. They did not have to have a warrior class. So when there were waves of Avestan-speaking peoples coming in, not only from Central Asia, but from Afghanistan, because the pressure on Iran and Afghanistan was from Anatolia, from the Hittite empire that finally took over Egypt and was taking over all of Iran and into Afghanistan, were pushing those Central Asian Avestan-speaking people into India. In fact, they came in 2 different waves because there were 2 different pushes by the Hittite empire. They brought their Avestan language, but they were met by a sophisticated language that was native to India and already had been toned to the Akkadian of this great swath of trading empires, not empires so much, but confederations of an enormous quality, and that those people spoke a language that brought some Aryan words into play from the Avestic, but many of their words already were from the Akkadian, and most of their syntax, most of the grammar was native to what we would call Black India. And when we come next week, we'll take a closer look at the way in which this is of enormous importance, because it changes the time forms of civilization from being inevitable to being creative, if we can remember to do it. More next week.